guys, welcome back to Archi Diaries. So this week I'm going to be walking you through my design work, and it's been pretty good this past week. The week before that, not so much. I feel like I kind of got sidetracked with a lot of different tasks I gave myself and wasn't really up to scratch, so I skipped a week, but we're back and I've done a lot more research and a lot more designing, so hopefully I can just walk you through that. So I've been looking into how Persian carpets are made and really kind of like diving deep into the process. So what I've done here on this page is kind of include precedents where people are kind of drawing on these kind of big large graph papers called cartoons, and basically they use this as a template to then kind of weave the patterns of the carpet as they're going along, and these are like obviously to a bigger scale as well. So what I've done is taken a previous collage of mine and turned it into this line drawing, almost like a cartoon, and I've also established that I'm going to be designing a particular type of Persian carpet which is called a Tabriz carpet, and it's from an area in Iran, and it has particular kind of like characteristics. So for example, they have a lighter feel because they're quite, you know, they have short trimmed piles, and they include lots of motifs like the one I've designed. So it'll generally have a border and then kind of like secondary elements, and then it might have like a main medallion or pattern or whatever it is. And so I was basically just doing research into how these Tabriz carpets are made, and I ended up looking at a weaving process. There's a fantastic website which kind of like walks you through the process on a much smaller scale, and it kind of like clarified how the weave pattern is produced and the differences between different kinds of weave patterns, and how they kind of I guess identify Persian carpets based on like the knots. So for example, in this image you can see this is called a 1N weave because this is from the back, and it's because there is only kind of one node visible. Another type of weave is called the 2N weave, where you can see two nodes visible from the back. From the front it's just one, but there's kind of like different kind of like patterns and techniques to weaving, which I found really interesting, and so I feel like it was really important for me to establish this research really early on. And then what I've done is taken another previous collage of mine and kind of like pixelated it. There's like a really good like generator that does it for you automatically, just to kind of understand what these patterns might look like if they were knots, for example. And now the idea is to kind of like take the same texture that you see in these images and kind of like start applying it to whatever I'm designing. I was also looking at different techniques of weaves, and they all have like a story behind them. Either they're from a particular region or they're designed to do a particular thing for a specific material like silk or wool. And in the previous page, the kind of like images that you saw, they're usually made from Turkish knots, which are symmetrical, as opposed to Persian knots, which are asymmetrical. And there's kind of like a difference in, you know, the end result as well. And another interesting thing is that basically like the more knots you have in a carpet, the higher the resolution of the carpet and the more kind of like detailed the design. And a typical carpet might have around, I think it's about 900 knots per square inch, so that's quite a lot. And I found this also like a really interesting fact that I was hoping to use. And so the plan now is to kind of take these weaves that are already established and then start designing my own, either by like merging them or physically trying to like weave something, or kind of like playing around with this idea of digital infrastructure and bringing in kind of like circuit board design, which you'll see later on. These are just a couple of drawings of looms, vertical looms. So this is typically what you'd use to loom a carpet like this, and basically they have vertical threads, and then what they do is kind of like do a series of knots horizontally, add a weft thread on top to kind of keep it in place. They'll like brush it down and keep it very kind of like tight and concise, and then they'll like trim it all together. So I found like this kind of interesting because obviously there's various tools and things involved, which might also like come back later on if you're thinking about kind of like the project on a bigger scale and what it might end up being. I think at this stage it's kind of like almost a garden city, a new kind of like layer of infrastructure which resembles paradise or aims to resemble paradise, and therefore will have kind of like certain districts and towns and kind of like, again, infrastructure which is digitally located, and basically it will be kind of like you're building this new kind of like layer step by step, and then eventually you'll kind of have a very kind of thick layer of city, which is like a carpet. And yeah, I'm not really sure as to like what the function of this project is yet, but that's still kind of like okay because there's still plenty of time to figure that out. Another one of my tasks from last week was to start kind of like designing objects, and I've been doing that every now and then, but I really wanted to then incorporate it within a particular like design element. So this is the fountain of computer mice. I've modeled this in SketchUp using elements from the 3D warehouse, and I wanted to again play on this idea of paradise and gardens, and I thought I kind of linked like this idea that a computer mouse moves, water also moves, and a common element in Mughal gardens is a water fountain. So I kind of created this element. I did an early kind of like collage just to envision what it might look like and to get kind of like the proportions in my head. And then I also made this kind of like more architectural object, which I basically took the framework from an actual substation diagram and then tried to replicate that, so you can see the water fountains on top of these four towers, and then essentially this becomes a utility station or a substation. The other elements aren't so kind of like detailed, or you know, they don't really have the materiality behind them isn't really thought out yet because this is still a work in progress. And the feedback that I got this week was basically to kind of like really think about the rendering style of how I want to represent these things, because I feel like here it's gotten a little bit messy, and the kind of like drawings I was trying to replicate with this planimetric view, they usually don't have shadows, for example. And so I think developing this language and refining the style of the project is probably my next step, just so that these things can be kind of viewed in a more intricate way. This is a collage I did on Photoshop. So I basically took the road networks of Chicago and tried to embed kind of like a circuit board image within it. And so you have all these like different wires, but then you get like the odd kind of like connections with the road. And then this is supposed to be the river, which is a different image. And then what I've done is, where you usually might have like small like processor units and whatever, I've embedded my previous collage patterns that I created, pixelated them, and then kind of like dropped them into the gaps. So I think the point of doing these collages is that I really wanted to experiment with how this idea that obviously on a smaller scale in an object, a circuit board has a purposeful composition, and so we can use that same technique to then design this urban framework. And so another collage I did basically looked at trying to do the same thing. Let me turn it this way around. So basically this collage looked to kind of like weave in different elements. So I'm not sure if you can tell on camera, but basically I've chopped up parts of this circuit board diagram and tried to like weave in, as you would in a carpet, these other elements. So you have kind of like, you know, these circuit board cutouts, but then you also have like plans and shapes from the charbags, which I looked at earlier, which is the Persian paradise gardens, and their kind of like layout. And then I've overlaid that on top of the part of New York's electrical grid. So I think it might be a bit familiar when you kind of look at this sort of image in the background, but I think the point was to see whether or not you could kind of like embed these networks and then create distinct kind of like spaces. So you can imagine like the substation I designed earlier could possibly be like fitted into there. So yeah, I think this week went quite well and I was happy with the work I've produced, and now it's really about kind of like taking each thing and starting to kind of like link it together, either through drawings or the representation style or the graphic style of the portfolio as well. And yeah, just keep experimenting and keep kind of like developing that language. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on this week, probably just doing a lot more drawings and figuring out kind of like textures and that kind of stuff. But that's all for this week. If you do have any questions, let me know. If there's anything that you'd like to see from me in this video or like further videos, let me know and then I will try my best to do so. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week.